Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first in our series of sports science webinars for the Be Ready to Play programme in association with UPMC. My name is Seamus Burns from Connacht GAA, and I'll be your host for the evening. Tonight we have Helen McElroy from clinic, who's clinic director at Focus Physiotherapy and Sports Performance. She's also the lead physio with the Tyrone GAA Academy squads as well. Helen is one of the top practitioners of physiotherapy in the country, and she's going to talk us through tonight something that should be of a lot of interest to us as we prepare to get back on the pitch, hopefully in the coming weeks and months. So the title of tonight's webinar is Preparing to Train and Play, How to Decrease Your Risk of Injury. Just a couple of things in relation to the webinar tonight. We have a comment box at the top where you can put questions in. So feel free to put them in. Obviously, I'm just looking at the attendance list here at the minute, and the numbers are kind of very high at the moment. So we probably won't get to all the questions, but what we'll do is we'll keep an eye on them as they're coming in, and we'll pick the most prevalent ones, the ones that are repeated, and we'll have a few questions at the end. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Helen, and she can take it from there. There might be just a little lag here for a second while Helen gets her presentation up, so just stick with us. Your mic is just on mute there, Helen, at the moment.
Is that me off now?
Yeah, you're up and running there. If you just want to put your screen up to full size, you'll be away with it, I think.
Yeah. Is that okay? You can see and hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect. Looking well.
Okay, so first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks for the introduction. So as Seamus said, I am speaking tonight on preparing to train and play and how to decrease your injury risk. Okay, so just a little bit about my background. So I'm a chartered physiotherapist. I graduated in 2008, and since then I've kind of specialised in sports medicine. So in 2018, then I finished my PhD, which was focused on hip and groin injury in Gaelic football. So we looked at inter-county Gaelic footballers for that. I've worked at inter-county level across all codes, so ladies football, camogie, hurling and men's football over the last kind of 12-13 years. Currently my role is as clinic director of Focus Physio and Performance, so that is in our Tyrone, and then I also work alongside the Tyrone Academy, so we look after anybody from kind of that under 17 down. So yeah, just then my involvement kind of in this programme, I was asked just to be on the GAA Physiotherapy and Rehabilitation Working Group. So that's part of the new wider sports science working group. So that's led by Dr. Aoife Lane. So on our physiotherapy working group, then we have Eamon O'Reilly chairing that. We have Rena Buckley, Enda White and Enda King. So we've put an awful lot of work into that in the start of this year, the end of last year, start of this year, where we're trying to promote excellence in physio and rehab across all Gaelic games, athletes and codes, and trying to align that all Gaelic players have access to the same level of services. We're trying to support and educate our professionals, our teams, our coaches, our county boards, and our athletes, and to just promote best practice and improve the standards of care. So tonight's webinar then, I've been asked to do the very broad topic of injury prevention. So to start off, can we prevent injury? Some strategies and frameworks and things looking at some of those things. Risk identification, looking at the individual athlete profile, touching a wee bit on workload and that element of injury prevention. Some injury specific tips, so we're going to look at specifically hamstring and hip and groin, because those are two of the biggest injuries within the GAA. Looking at some warm-ups and some recovery strategies. So I suppose the first question there, can we prevent injury? Not all injury, we can't. Obviously, we're playing contact sports, so with the nature of playing sport, there is an inherent risk of injury. What I'm hoping that you'll get from this is that there are some ways of mitigating risk, but we cannot prevent all injury. So I suppose this is quite a unique situation. So just looking at last year's coming out of last year's lockdown, what did we learn? So this was published quite recently just from the Bundesliga. So they found that there was 3.12 times higher risk of injury post-lockdown versus pre-lockdown. So on average per game, there was 0.84 injuries after lockdown, whereas pre-lockdown, they were only finding 0.27 injuries per game. And the other thing that they found was that 17% of athletes sustained injury in their first competitive match post-lockdown or prior to this match. So in the training leading up to the first game or during the first game, 17% of athletes sustained an injury. From there then, as more games were played, the injury rate didn't increase. So what they were suggesting from that is that there is a suboptimal sport readiness following that period of lockdown. So the lesson that I'd like us to take us from that is that these first few weeks coming out of this lockdown are quite crucial. This is where a lot of these injuries could be picked up as players go back onto the field and return to training. And so it's kind of what can we do from there, you know, and what strategies can we put in place to reduce that risk. Okay, so one of the things that we would use from a rehab setting is this, it's a lovely framework on returning to the chaos of sport. And I kind of like that phrase of returning to the chaos of it, because I think that's what we are missing now. I'll just bring this up, that this is the bit that's most relevant for us at the moment. So at the moment, we are in this very high control setting. Over on the left here, this green part, we're in this very high control setting of we've no access to pitches, we've no access to gyms, nobody is training in groups. You know, so everything is very controlled. It's all straight lines. There's no change of direction. Well, there may be change of direction, but there's no indecision to that. So what we want, and we would use this, as I said, in a rehab setting. So if we're trying to take a player from a long-term injury back to play, we will have them in that high control setting at the start and gradually then reintroduce that little bit of chaos to try and get them back to sport. And I think it's a nice way of thinking about it, just because this is quite a unique setting. This is not like coming out of or going into any usual pre-season where you may possibly have been playing five-a-side over the winter or playing basketball, or, you know, things where you have been doing accelerations, decelerations, putts, turns, that kind of thing. All of that has been taken from our players at the moment. So we need to be quite mindful of that. These players are now going from quite a high control setting, so we need to gradually over the next coming weeks introduce that chaos in a meaningful way and in quite a staged way. So we shouldn't be throwing them into full contact day one. Obviously, I'd like to think nobody's doing that, but it's just to try and think about how we're actually going to guide these next few weeks. Okay, so moving on from there, this is a really nice framework, and I always kind of like to big up our Irish research that we're doing here as well. So this is work that is being done by Mark Rowe on injury risk management. So I like this just to break down these 6 stages. We're going to go through these over the rest of this presentation. So one is looking at the injury trends within our sports. Secondly, then looking at what risk factors for injury that we currently know. Then going on to what are the demands of the sport that we're trying to get these people back to. Looking at, for any of the athletes that are here, looking at what you need to consider with your own athlete profile, what's your own baseline, and how do we move forward from there. And then looking at athlete management as we move into the season and how we monitor these athletes as we progress on through. Okay, so to start off then, if we are looking at our injury trends, injuries within the GAA, so there are those big 5, and as I said, we will touch on the hamstring and the hip and groin a little bit later on. But the big 5 there that we're looking at are your hamstring at 23%, your hip and groin in around 15%, knee sitting at 11, ankles also sitting around 11, and then your shoulder around 6%. So also within the GAA, acute injury is 3 times more likely in comparison to your chronic injury. And we are sustaining a lot more non-contact injuries than contact injuries. Okay, so those non-contact injuries are the ones that we are able to have some influence on mitigating risk. And then it's also just noticeable that last season, despite the shortened season, there wasn't a massive change in the insurance claims. So there wasn't a massive drop in injuries last year, and the number of claims was still in and around what it usually would be. So we're quite aware that even with a condensed season, there was still the same amount of injuries picked up. The other thing that we need to be aware of here is that player availability is actually one of the biggest predictors of team success. So we know that from looking at other sports, that if you have your full cohort of players available, you are much more likely to be successful within that season. So not only from just a player welfare point of view, but also from a team success point of view, keeping injuries as low as possible is obviously most beneficial for everybody. Okay, so moving on. Oh, sorry, I think I've brought myself way back. Sorry guys, I'm just gonna, I did that. Okay, so moving on then to stage 2, so looking at the risk factors for injury. So what do we currently know for sure? So the only things that we can be certain of is that previous injury is the biggest risk factor for further injury, and that increasing age is also a risk factor for injury. Now, the unfortunate thing about that is that there's nothing we can do about either of those. Those things are not modifiable. So what can we do? So we need to look then at some site-specific risk factors, and we'll go through those in a moment. But now we're going to try and look at what we can actually control ourselves. Okay, so if we're looking at then the stage 3 of this framework, you're looking at the demands of our sport. Okay, so I always like to use this from a rehab perspective as well. I love this quote, begin with the end in mind. So what does a fully from a rehab perspective, what does a fully rehabbed athlete look like? From our perspective, what does a high performing athlete look like? Okay, so what are the main things that we need to get them to be able to do, and what are the demands of our sport? So if we're looking at this is where the research has been done at Intercounty Gaelic Football and Hurling, we know that they cover between 9.2 and 10 kilometres per game. And we know that they cover between 1.5 and 2 kilometres in high speed running. Okay. Round about 44 sprint actions and 160 accelerations per game, covering roughly about 12 metres per acceleration. And they spend about 0.5 kilometres, so about 500 metres in that sprinting capacity. So there is that difference between your high speed running and your sprinting. Okay. So breaking that down, if we're looking at that's what we need these players to be able to do. Breaking that down a little bit further, there are some position-specific demands. So here we're looking at your full back line, your half back line, your midfields, your half forwards and your full forwards. Okay, so you can see in that middle third there, your half backs, your midfields and your half forwards, they cover much more distance, both in your high speed running also your sprint distance. So just bearing that in mind with if you're a player yourself, this is what you need to be able to do, or if you're coaching, that there is that positional difference within your team. Okay, so moving on from then the demands of the sport, just to look at the athlete profile, and we want to just spend a wee bit of time going through some of these things that make up an individual athlete's profile. Okay, so as we mentioned before, their age is one, so increasing age does increase your risk for injury. There's not much we can do about that, but at the same time we can factor that in. As some players get older, we may look at their workload, we may look at their participation in training, we might look at their other demands, so that we're still managing that player quite well, that they're able to play further on down in their career. Also looking at, and this is particularly pertinent for us within that academy setup where you're looking at other sports and teams. So we obviously do want our players to play multi-sport at that young age, but we need to be quite mindful of the demands of those other sports and the demands of their training sessions, what other teams they're involved in. There's that age-old debate of these under 17s to under 20s being involved in their schools, their clubs, their senior setups, their minors, they're pulled in all directions. So just being quite mindful of that, and what does their week look like? Okay, because all these things make up this profile of this athlete, which then influences their own individual training. Okay, as I said, then previous injury. So previous injury is one of the biggest risk factors for future injury, and again, that should be taken into consideration when you're looking at, if you're an athlete yourself, looking at how you bring yourself back out of this lockdown. Consider what you feel are your niggly injuries. Look at your own baseline of your own previous injuries and how can you address some of the weaknesses maybe that you've had. And then working on around there, the position that you play at. Obviously, we've just looked at the different demands at these different positions. The training history, again, I suppose everybody will be coming out of this lockdown at different baselines. So, you know, have you had the luxury of having a gym at home? Have you been able to access some sort of equipment? And what's your training history? So have you a background in conditioning, in gym training and that kind of thing, or is some of this stuff quite new to you? So this is where your baseline might differ massively from your teammates' baseline. So just be quite aware of that not everybody is coming out of this lockdown on an even keel, okay? Some lifestyle factors to consider, obviously, things like work demands, study demands, family demands, those kind of things, commute to training, commute to work, all of those things kind of need to be considered whenever we're looking at our own athlete profile. So these are kind of pointers of what a player can do now. Take a good honest look at where you're currently at and how are we bridging that gap to getting you back to that high chaos environment that we were just talking about, that you need to be able to play your sport. So build your own athlete profile of your biggest limitations, your biggest weaknesses, but also look at your own strengths. Where can you improve and where can you also start the habits now as we edge out of this lockdown that will stand to you then whenever this season starts. Okay, so looking at that, then going into how we manage the load of these players over the next the coming weeks and months. Okay, so this is quite nice in that we've talked about some of the previous or the predisposing factors for this. In that, as I said, there's age, previous injury, strength levels, that kind of stuff. Those are predisposing factors to injury. None of that really matters if the player isn't exposed to a load that is going to cause that injury. So we can talk a lot about these predisposing factors, but people don't get injured solely due to having a predisposing factor. People get injured because their load exposure is higher than what they're able to tolerate. Okay, so if this happens frequently enough or at a big enough spike to cause a big acute injury, you will get tissue breakdown and you will get injury. Okay, it's as simple as that. So in essence, if we can improve load tolerance, we can improve their likelihood that their load exposure, then what they're exposed to in training, won't be greater than that tolerance. So this is kind of fundamental to injury risk modification, and this is where we can have the greatest impact. Now, I would err on a bit of caution there in that we don't want to underload our athletes either. We don't want to underload them and err on that side of caution where they're not then prepared for the demands of the game. We need to kind of get that balance right, okay? So that load exposure needs to be improved incrementally, giving the players adequate time to adapt and recover between sessions, and to reflect the nature and the needs of the sport. Okay, so bringing it together, everything we've talked about up to now, and just to be able to get that balance right, that we're loading them enough, and that they are getting enough stimulus to get stronger, to get faster, and to improve that kind of buffer level for you that you can work on with their performance, but not to spike their load too much that is going to cause tissue stress. Okay, so higher chronic training load has been shown to improve the player robustness and improve performance. So it's keeping that training load at a level where they are able to perform well, recover well, and be able to adapt then as the season progresses, okay, without them breaking down. Okay, so next up then we're going to look at some site-specific injuries. Okay, so I picked out the big two there of your hamstring and your hip and groin. They're the two on the top of the list when it comes to the GAA injuries. Okay, so first of all, if we look at your hamstring, so some risk factors that have been shown for hamstrings specifically are, again, previous injury, not just hamstring injury, but also ACL and calf injury. So it's not just looking at that area in isolation. Injuries to the ACL and calf have also been shown to be a risk factor for future hamstring injury. Flexibility, the amount of times that I get players coming into me and saying, oh, my hamstrings I'm just not flexible, you know, that's why I always get hamstring injuries. Flexibility is actually not a known risk factor for injury. The other one then that has been massively studied is strength. So I think there's been a lot of emphasis put on Nordic curls and that kind of stuff. There's been a lot of, it would be kind of mainstream now at this point that Nordic curls are added into most injury prevention programs, but I think that's all well and good, but we need to consider all elements of strength. So all contraction types, all lengths, because the hamstring doesn't just work eccentrically, but you're also looking at with your high speed running, that kind of thing, you're looking at trying to get your hamstring strong and long through all ranges, okay? And also just consider the placement of the likes of these strength exercises throughout the week. We do see a lot of Nordic curls being thrown in just before games. Players don't like doing them because they do leave you sore. So just consider better placement of some of these overloading type exercises within your week if you're planning sessions for your players, okay? The other thing then to consider is speed. So one of the main mechanisms of your hamstring tear, usually you'll tear your hamstring either in an overstretching, which is a bit more rare, or usually within the Gaelic football context at speed, okay? So we, some of the links between speed and or high speed running and hamstring injury is to do with some of the sprinting kinematics, okay? So those things are well worth considering, plus also then where you actually sorry, I've lost myself there. Yeah, so we're just going to talk about speed then in the next one. So what the last thing I just want to say here is that these risk factors don't operate in isolation. So we can't just look at, you know, strength in isolation. We can't look at speed in isolation. All of these things need to be factored in within the strength and conditioning programs, within the pitch-based work, and also then looking at your sprinting. So are you actually hitting top speed? So there is some research coming out now to say that you may need to add in the top speed running at some point in the week if it's not been hit in games. And you'd actually be quite surprised that sometimes you don't hit top speed within a game. And especially if maybe they're substituted or the nature of the game is just that it's not that intense, that you're not hitting absolute max speed. It is still important to include that within your training, so that we are making sure that our athletes are still hitting top speed at some point within the week, okay? And the reason for that is just that we want to keep them, that their top speed is still quite high, and that it allows us that buffer underneath, and that if they're hitting consistently those high speed running speeds, that their top speed isn't declining, okay? That we're still hitting that as a sprinting vaccine. It would be kind of the novel term for this. So this is sometimes why you see players going out that have maybe not played a full game in rugby or soccer or whatever, go out and doing the high speed running on the pitch after, okay, because they're trying to get them those running volumes and those high speed volumes so that they're maintaining those top speeds, okay. So moving on then to groin pain. So like hamstring injuries, risk factors for groin pain are multifactorial. I'm trying to give you something that you can kind of take away from tonight, and I suppose one of the things that we would use and would encourage a lot of our athletes who've had a history of groin pain to use is this adduction squeeze test, okay? So it's quite simple, and there's no equipment needed, no nothing. So it's essentially, as you can see in the picture, that long lever, you're getting them to squeeze. So the player there is pushing their two legs in against the elbow and the hand of that person. So what we're asking them there for is a measure of pain, okay? So we would use this in any of our athletes returning from groin pain as a measure of if they're tolerating the training load. So if their pain level is 0 to 2, we would say, okay, continue. If it's 3 to 5, we would say, ask us, is what's happening, or why is this happening, or analyze what has changed, what has maybe put you into that amber zone. So it's kind of contact the physio or drop us a message or something, and we'll always want to know when you're in that amber zone. I hate it whenever they come back to you and say, yeah, I'm a pain 7 or 8 out of 10, because at that stage you're likely having to kind of pull them out of training or modify training in a bigger way, okay? So for those people who have had that history of hip and groin pain, this is something to kind of look at, what is your pain level like prior to training? Does that increase after training? So it's something very, very simple that you can do at home or with somebody that that can give you some indication of whether you're coping with those training loads. It's not the be all and end all, and it's not a one size fits all, because obviously groin pain is so multifactorial and there's so many different elements to it. But it's something nice and simple that if your pain levels are starting to increase, that we can kind of say, right, let's look at this, what's happening here, okay? And following on from that then, recognizing some of those warning signs of some of those overuse type injuries, I think is quite a nice thing to look at. So again, these are things that we would include within the education of our players, any players that are returning from injury. So we would teach our players to recognize the warning signs of some of those more chronic injuries coming back, you know, or if they're starting to show the early signs of maybe breaking down. So things like if I take a hip or a groin as an example, things like stiffness in the hip the morning after a session, taking longer to recover. So, you know, they train on a Tuesday night and they feel like they're not recovered before Friday night session. Taking longer to warm up, you know, so it's taking them a good 45 minutes to an hour to warm up. That's too long. You know, you should feel like you're well ready for a session after 10-15 minutes. Losing top speed, and I suppose this is one thing that when an injury starts to affect their performance, that's when they then get concerned. You know, a lot of players are willing, they shouldn't be, but they are willing to play through a little bit of pain. But I find that if they're coming to us, they're starting to say, oh, I just can't get to top speed anymore. You know, so, and that might be happening quite a while. Earlier onset of fatigue. So if you're getting, you know, 45-50 minutes into a training session or the same in a game, and you're really starting to feel very fatigued at the end, you know, it's just these are all kind of just little flags, you know, for you to kind of think, right, is there something I need to address here? Obviously the onset of pain, any kind of loss of strength or power. So going back to the likes of that squeeze test, you know, if you're feeling that you can't just get a decent squeeze strength on that. Then other things relating back again to performance. So if they're acceleration or deceleration, or they just don't feel like they can turn sharply, they don't feel like they can accelerate or explode as they would like to, or their deceleration is getting you know, a wee bit sloppy and it's taking them longer to slow down or turn. Okay, those things are things again that we they're just little warning signs of, is their performance starting to decline, and is this the start of maybe a breakdown of an injury? Okay, and that their movement capacity is poor. Okay, so things like going back to the gym, are they losing squat depth, is their lunge patterns not as good as they usually are, those kind of things. Just be aware of all of that. And again, this is building back into your athlete profile. So if you know what when you feel good, and then you're a wee bit more then in tune to when things just aren't right. Okay, and I would always prefer that an athlete sends me a message or asks me a question early on, when these things are easier put right, or you know, there's just something needed changed quite simply, or you know, a little exercise is added into their warm-up or something that is just enough to keep them ticking over, rather than getting to the stage where we've had to, you know, remove them from sport and or they're not fit to play. Okay, so again, as I said, then if you're a coach, you can be looking at all of the above as well. Any dip in performance, this might be noticed by the manager. So if a player just isn't having a good run of form, might be nothing to do with an injury, and sometimes might blame an injury unnecessarily, but at the same time, it's just something, it's a question for a coach to have, you know, is there anything going on there? I suppose if you're working within a bigger setup where you might look at some form of questionnaire or wellness scores, or a VAS, again looking at pain levels, and if you have access to the likes of GPS, so you're looking at, can you quantify if they're getting to their top speeds, or are their running times or their running distances changing? So that might not be in relation to an injury, but at the same time, it's building the picture around that athlete. Or if they're coming into us, is there again a decrease in range of movement, or is there a decrease in strength and power? Okay. So the other thing just to be aware of here is that time loss injury is 3 to 6 times higher when it is preceded by a player reporting a niggle. Okay. So within that, what we're looking at is that if a player reports a niggle, within 7 days of that, they're 3 to 6 times higher to be out with a time loss injury. So I know we kind of sometimes traditionally would fob off, oh, it's just a tight hamstring or whatever. It's always better to communicate that back and let the medical staff or the physio or the coach or whatever, you know, discuss that through. And is this an issue or is it not an issue? If it's not an issue, just continue on. If it is an issue, then it's easier to nip it in the bud sooner. Okay, and that leads on nicely to the next bit. Okay, so what we're looking at here is coaches, and can coaching leadership style influence injury? And this is really, really nice. I find this really fascinating, that certain types of leadership from a head coach have been found to negatively impact injury rates. So what we're looking at here is that injury levels are lower in clubs where coaches communicate well, with a clear positive vision, where they support and communicate well with their staff, and they give players encouragement and recognition. Okay, so that was done within soccer, professional soccer. So anecdotally, I do see this all the time. The clubs and teams that have the higher injury rates are the ones that generally, not all the time, but sometimes they don't have those good lines of communication with management. And I think that's crucial. You know, there's nothing worse than a player coming in and saying, I don't want to tell the manager, you know, that they're afraid to tell the manager that maybe they have that little bit of a niggle. These are the players that they don't want to say, oh, I don't want to tell them that I'm out injured at the weekend. You know, we need to have that open line of communication of, right, okay, well, you know, for you to make the weekend, we're going to modify this week's training, you know, or that it's easy to lift the phone and explain things to management, and that the medical team and the management team are working really well together. So that should be across all levels, all codes. That's not just an inter-county thing, you know. I will have no issue lifting a phone to a manager and saying, look, this is the plan. And I think if you have a plan and communicate that well, that should always be respected, and the player should always be, you know, consulted within that as well. Okay, so moving on then to other factors to consider. So the other big ones then would be looking at recovery, looking at sleep, and looking at nutrition. Okay, so we want to have that holistic view on injury prevention, and more so athlete wellness. All right, so I'm not going to talk about the nutrition, and I'm just going to touch on the recovery aspect of this, but I'm not going to talk about the nutrition. There is a nutrition webinar coming up, so just be sure to tune into that one. They're the experts in the nutrition, but nutrition does have some influence on recovery, and obviously then on injury prevention. Okay, so just from a recovery perspective, then I find this was lovely. So this is a curriculum that the FA have put together. So this is credit to Peter Turney. I think he was with Leinster Rugby, and now he works for the FA. So they talk about the other 22 hours. Okay, so what they're looking at there is the other part of the day where you're not training or playing. Okay, and I suppose within the FA, what they particularly are looking at here is the day before a match, the day of the match, and then the day after the match. Okay, so their recovery strategy is broken down into the 4 R's. So those are react, regenerate, restore, and refine. Okay, so with the react one, then that's how you consider your nutrition needs directly after a game, and your recovery strategies directly after a game. So a lot of this can be quite personal, and also based on, you know, the demands of that game or of that training session. Okay, so again, I'm not going to go into the nutrition part of it because that is not my field. But some of the recovery strategies, some players like compress, and some players like get a massage after a training set or after a game. Some players like ice baths. That's all quite personal. Okay, and I think the other thing with this is that there is no, you know, magic bullet for recovery either. Okay, it all has to come down to the players' individual preferences and what makes them feel best recovered. And it all depends on the demands that they've put on their own bodies during the session as well. Okay, so the regenerate then may come that afternoon or that night or the next morning. Okay, so and within the FA, they kind of talk about, they discuss with the players how they feel. If they're feeling tight, or maybe the pit's heavy and they're feeling that, you know, the legs are a bit heavy with that, they might put on a movement session or yoga or something like that. So have those conversations just about how do your players feel after that, and what would best be the way to address that. There's so many different theories on recovery. Some people like to get into the ocean, some people like to go for a walk. One of the things is to just be able to switch off as well is quite important, to actually mentally process the game and recover from the game in that perspective as well. So for some people, that's taking their kids to the playground. For some people, that's going out for a walk. It's going to the beach, walking the dog. Any of those things can also be considered recovery. So recovery isn't necessarily an ice bath, because some people hate those and don't feel that they're beneficial at all. Okay. So then with restore, you're looking at some individual work. So this might be where you add in some of your Prehab work if you're coming back from a niggly injury. So there's personal choice there. What do you feel works best for you? You know, is that getting a yoga session in the day after? Is it doing, you know, a 15-minute spinal movement session, you know, if your lower back's been giving you a bit of bother? So that would be quite individual. And then refine is looking at movement focus and priming for the next session. So that's where you start to look ahead from your Sunday night. You're maybe now into Monday afternoon, Monday night or Tuesday morning. So how are you actually going to prep yourself then for Tuesday morning? So obviously within this, they're taking in the nutrition elements of this as well. As I said, I'm not going to go into that, but it's how then you don't just try to recover from Sunday, you're also trying to prepare for Tuesday. Okay. So moving on from there, then we're just going to discuss a little bit on warm-ups. So the very, very basics of a warm-up, we're looking at the basic principles of a warm-up here. So this RAMP protocol is quite nice. So we're looking at raise, activate, mobilize, and potentiate. Okay, so if you're looking at the raise element of this, it's increasing, it's the basics, okay, of increasing muscle temperature, blood flow, and a bit of neural activation. Okay, so that's the first couple of minutes of your warm-up. And then activate from there. So engaging the muscles in preparation for the upcoming session. This should always reflect the aims of the session and the demands of the session. So the warm-up doesn't have to be the same for every session. And if it's something quite specific within that session that you're doing, you should be priming those joints and those muscles within your warm-up, okay? So again, with mobilize, then you're moving yourself through those ranges of movement and focusing on the movement patterns which will be used within the session or game. And this is also where I'd actually add in some individual time. So I suppose coming from a rehab perspective, if anybody that we deal with is coming back from an injury, we would always give them, you know, maybe 10 minutes of work to do within their warm-up that focuses on that particular injury. So for the likes of a hamstring one, you might be getting them to do your single leg RDLs, or you might be getting them to, you know, if it's a knee injury, you might be getting them to do some jumps and lands. If it's an ankle injury, they might be doing some hopping, that kind of thing. So usually if you can give players 5 to 10 minutes to work on something that's quite individual to them, that they feel they are then able to feel completely prepared within their own warm-up. One warm-up might not leave every player on that squad completely ready for the session ahead. So I always find it's quite nice in giving them 5 to 10 minutes of their own time, or putting them into groups is maybe another way of managing that. So sometimes we would, based on, like if we're looking after a team based on their previous injury questionnaire from the start of the season, we'd maybe have a hamstring group or a hip group or a lower back group or something where that particular group are using 5 or 10 minutes to work on that particular area. Okay. And then the last part of the warm-up is the potentiate part. So this is where we gradually increase the stress on the body. So this is where it becomes more like what the plans of the game will be. So you're getting the body ready for the upcoming session or game. So with the increase in the speeds that they're doing, an increase in the intensity there, okay? So there's been a lot of research that has went into sports-specific warm-ups. So I suppose the FIFA 11 Plus is probably the most famous one within soccer. AFL have done then their 31st. It's quite an old one now, actually. It's out several years. And then hockey have their own specific one, and we're quite lucky that within the GAA there's two. Okay, so there's the GAA 15. That can be found on the learning portal of the GAA website. All the videos and everything are there. So if you haven't heard of the GAA 15 before, and you're managing the team, and you're kind of thinking, where do I start with this? Brilliant start. Okay, so it gives you kind of the fundamentals of what you can include in the warm-up, and there's it's 15 minutes, and it's broken into some running, some strengthening based around the core and the legs, then there's balance and control partner contacts, then moves into some jumping, some hamstring specific stuff, and then some sports specific movements. Okay. And then there's also the GAA Activate one, which was a collaboration between Ulster GAA and the Sports Institute. Again, that is, it could be 8 or 9 years old at this point. But similar to that then, with it is 3 phases. So there's running, cutting and landing mechanics to start. And then there's phase 2, which focuses on strength, plyometrics and balance. And then phase 3 is agility and power. Okay, so it gives you a bit of a structure of, you know, you're nailing all the basics there within your warm-up. So again, if you're coaching and you're kind of thinking, right, the warm-up is somewhere here, I could get a little bit of injury prevention work done, that's definitely a starting point for you. Okay, there's been a little bit of research done around both of these. And within the hurling environment, there was a study done in 2018 where it looked at secondary school or post-primary school athletes. So what they actually found was that there was an overall 30 to 45% reduction in injuries in the intervention group. So those who actually completed this GAA 15 had between, so there's 30% reduction in lower limb, and overall there was a 45% reduction in injuries in that intervention group. So you can't really get much better than that for a 15-minute warm-up. Okay, and then Edwina O'Malley also looked at the neuromuscular outcomes. So she found that there was improved Y balance scores. So if we're able to improve that, and improved landing control outcomes in those who completed the intervention. So from a neuromuscular perspective, we would find that it is effective, and there has been that small study done within hurling as well, just looking at they had quite a big decrease in injury rates. Okay. So I suppose if we're looking now at the first steps on the journey out of lockdown and back to the pitch, considering all of that, where do we start and how do we put the structure to that? Well, this is where this Be Ready to Play program comes in perfectly. Okay, so this is a season-long program, and it's delivered through the GAALearning portal, and the work that has gone into this is absolutely phenomenal. So there's three phases to this, or there's three sections to this, sorry. There's a youth section, an adult section, and an advanced section. So for those people who have a little bit of training history, they can go into that advanced section. Okay. So I'm just going to bring you up a wee video just to talk about the this program.
Just having a bit of an issue there with the audio on that one, Helen, I think.
Oh, hang on. Is that working? No.
No, I'm not picking that up on my side anyway.
Not sure what's happened there. I can add this video in at the end anyway. I can put it back up. No point in listening to nothing there.
Yeah, you can do it.
Okay. Oh. Okay, so just to give you a bit of an overview, then the phases within this program then are the activity phase, the development phase, prepare to play phase, and the prepare to perform phase. So if you had been able to hear the video, they would have talked you through that it covers all aspects of athlete development. So there's sections on mobility and stability, speed and agility, strength and power, and endurance. Okay, so it is holistic. It's followed up then by the webinar support. Okay, so nights like tonight, where you have that athletic development support or the sports science support, you have the full athletic development program, which is updated. Des can correct me later if I'm wrong. I think it's every 2 weeks. So you have it builds progressively every 2 weeks. So it starts off at that nice baseline. You find your own baseline, find where you're comfortable. There's progressions and regressions for all the exercises within the program. And then you're backed up then by some of the sports science working group. So I have had the privilege of doing the first one, representing obviously the physiotherapy side of it, but there is the coaching element, the sports performance element, as I said, the nutrition side of it as well. So, and then there is a coaching webinar series as well. So I'm almost done. I just want to bring up the next coaching webinar. So this is the technical side of things. I suppose there's no point being injury free if you can't play the game. So the technical aspect of hurling, camogie and football. Okay, so there's 4 phenomenal speakers there coming in with that. And that webinar is on the 30th of March at 7 p.m. Okay, so that's in a couple of weeks. So I would encourage anybody who wants to put a wee bit of structure behind or going in or coming out of this lockdown, sorry, to sign up to the program. Take a look at it. All the videos and everything are online. And that's me finished. And just thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, let me know.
That's absolutely brilliant, Helen. To be fair, a huge amount of work went into that presentation there. And thanks a million. Very, very informative. I'm sure for the coaches online as well that they really, really will appreciate that. Especially the warning signs I thought were very, very helpful. Just a couple of questions that come in through the question and answers. As we say, we have a huge amount of people online at the moment. So there's been a lot of questions, but a lot of them are along a similar vein, so I'll just go pick a couple of them here at random. So just in relation to the surface we train on, do you think that the surface we train or play our games on has a bearing on injuries?
I suppose we get onto any surface we could now if we were allowed out, wouldn't we? But I suppose the answer to that is that there, as far as I'm aware, there's no research within the GAA to say that there is a difference in the surfaces. What I would say anecdotally, having seen quite a few players, is sometimes the change in surface is actually the bigger thing. So especially those athletes who've maybe had previous tendon injuries or those coming back from ACLs, I would be quite cautious of changing surface. So maybe going from a 4G onto a pitch, sometimes those can, or vice versa. And that happens quite a lot in the Irish winters. So just with pitch availability. So if you are a player who maybe has some of those that history of your chronic tendinopathies, be quite careful of that. That change in surface tendons don't like change. So that change in surface can sometimes be a wee bit aggravating. So there is a lot of work done on the shoes and the boots and that kind of stuff. I suppose it's not my field of expertise, but one thing I would say was be careful of that change of surface.
Excellent, really good. Just another one here to come in. I'm paraphrasing here because 2 or 3 people were along the same line. In relation to the workload, how do I know if I'm doing too much or too little with my players?
I suppose that all depends on whether you have access to any form of technology. You don't need to have. Obviously, if you have the luxury of having the likes of GPS, you can look at training load just from that. You can look at it from heart rate. So that's if you have the money and the access to that. If you don't, you can do something as simple as an RPE, so a session RPE, so that rate of perceived exertion. So what we mean by that is if you were to rate that session, so say you're the coach and you kind of think, right, I want this session to be 6 out of 10 in difficulty, then you take also the time of that session. So say it's an hour long, and you have, so that's 60 minutes, and you're rating it as a 6. Okay, you can ask every player on the team, or you can take a sample, of how difficult they felt the session. So it can sometimes be a little marker of, if you're only kind of rating the difficulty of it as a 6, but 80% of your players rated it as an 8 or a 9, either you've misjudged the difficulty of it, or are the players under recovered or something like that. So that session or PE is sometimes a nice marker and a very simple way of gaining some sort of quantification of workload. Not the be all and end all either, but if you've got no access to anything else, it's a nice place to start.
Excellent. And just there's been a few questions coming in about speed training. So if I am adding max speed running to a session, where is it best to include it? I assume that means in the structure of the session, but I'll leave that to you to talk.
Yeah. I suppose, like historically, we would kind of find that managers like to do this finisher and do their sprints at the end when they're fatigued. I would say no. For me, put it in straight after the warm up when the player's fresh. If you're asking them, if you're trying to dose that max speed so that they're getting that max speed session once a week, I would be putting it in when they're fresh. So maybe after a really good warm up, stick your max speed running in there.
Brilliant, that's really good. As I say, we could be here all night asking questions. We've had a good load of them on. I think we might just cut the question and answer session there as we're pushing on for time, and want to get Des Ryan in next. But again, thanks a million to you, Helen. An awful lot of work went into that presentation. Very informative, very useful going forward, and I think it was a really good presentation to start off the webinar series for. It's kind of underpins what we're about on the Be Ready to Play program, getting people back, hopefully injury free, and getting the games up and running again when we get a chance. So on behalf of all the attendees and everybody involved in the Be Ready to Play, I'd just like to thank you for your time on the presentation, Helen.
No problem. Thanks a million. The other thing I would say is if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop me a message. I think I had my email address and stuff up there. So if you have any questions, because I do appreciate that I put an awful lot of information up there and there's no way of going in through that, a lot of that in depth. So if you have a question, feel free to message me.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Just in relation to that as well, just a couple of people were asking in the question box as well. This the recording of this will be available up on the e-learning site in the coming days, so you'll be able to, if there's something that really piques your interest, you'll be able to look back in there, or if you're looking for a little bit further, you can contact Helen through her email address that she kindly provided. Again, thanks a million, Helen. That's a great job. So if you just want to stick with us here for a minute, Des Ryan, who's kind of the driving force behind the Be Right to Play program, just going to talk for a few minutes, just giving a bit of an update on what's coming up, what's been happening, and what's coming up in the program. You can go ahead there, Des.
Sure. Thanks, Seamus, and Helen. Thank you. That was fantastic. It's a huge challenge globally in all sports, really, getting back to playing and reducing the risk of injury. So some fantastic advice there for all of us, all coaches in clubs, in schools, all players, and great strength behind the advice there with the physio and rehab working group. So thanks. A few notes I took myself. Hamstrings, hips, groins, we've got to try and reduce those. The factors that increase the risk are age, previous history. Yeah, we can't do much, but we can keep a close eye on the players that have a training history, that have a good age, and then the things we can influence: strength, speed, workload, and that links nicely to the athletic development program, which I'll give you an update on in a moment. But great tips there on the squeeze test. Leadership, that's so important. Communication with the players, trust with the players. Coaches, you've got a big responsibility there to show great leadership in this phase coming back, and we're going to give you as much information as possible. Recovery, all the different parts of recovery, and as Helen says, we got the nutrition workshop coming up and more advice on that. And hey, isn't it great that a simple warm-up could reduce injuries by 45%? That's the GAA15 and GAA Activate. It's there, it's easy to follow, it's on the GAALearning website. It should be used, it's fantastic. 45% potential reduction in injuries. So lovely advice there. I'm just letting people know that tomorrow, the second 2 weeks of the athletic development program will be up, will be live. And every week, 2 weeks, we're going to try and improve it, listen to feedback. We've cut the videos to the different sections so it's easier to use. In the coming weeks, with the PDFs, will be hyperlinks to the exercise, the point in the video where the exercise is, so you can use it on your phone. And we're going to make it as user-friendly as possible for everybody. And it's for the coaches, it's for the players. Coaching the game should be at the centre of everything we do. This is about the sport, the Gaelic games. Athletic development and sports science should be delivered with the coach and through the coach. And that's what this is aiming to do, and also help players to be self-sufficient. So please encourage as many people to join, as many players to join. And if I may, I do love talking about this content. There was great questions there about returning to play, managing workload. If I may give an insight, I'm just off the pitch with the little Arsenal under-12s, and we're getting back to play here, thankfully. So last week they did 1 session. This week they're doing 2 sessions. Next week they're doing 3 sessions and a game, but we're going to rotate the players in the game to make sure they play a half a game or less. And I just did a little introduction to speed this second session, this second week, where we did it at the start of the session, just like Helen was saying. We didn't go max, but we got pretty close to it, and we'll go a little bit faster the next night and a little bit faster the night after that. So they're examples of what will be given in the athletic development program. Tips for the coaches so they can run these things in their session as they return, and suggestions how to return gradually. And gradually is the key. We can't rush back into this. and that'll help us be ready to play. So the next athletic development program of 2 weeks is out tomorrow. So make sure you check in. There'll be something there for everybody.
Great stuff, Des. That's absolutely brilliant. Thanks a million for all the hard work on this. Des touched on it there. Actually, just for those of you that mightn't be aware, but Des is the head of sports medicine and athletic development at Arsenal Football Club. A leader in the field of sports science, and he's the driving force behind the Be Ready to Play program. As he's also part of the sports science committee that has been set up under Aoife Lane. So all these kind of initiatives you can see coming forward in the GAA are based on really good practice with really good people involved. So thanks again there to Des. We're nearly finished, I think. Just in relation to what's going forward, as Helen outlined there in her own, just to touch a little date for your diary here. On this night, 2 weeks, the 30th of March at 7 p.m, we have our first of our coaching webinars. So we'll be looking at the technical coaching for hurling, camogie and Gaelic football, so something there for everybody. Fiona McHale, current Mayo ladies footballer, will be part of that. Johnny Doyle, the former Kildare legend and all-star, who's currently Director of Development at football with Kildare, will be joining Fiona, along with Niall Corcoran, who's former Dublin hurler and currently working with the Wexford Senior Hurlers, and Eileen Gleeson also, who's coach developer with the Camogie Association, and Eileen's also the Clare minor Camogie manager at the minute. So you have top people there doing a presentation on the technical coaching for hurling, camogie and football, so be sure to link in with us for that. The advertisement for that will go up through the usual social media, and for everyone that's registered on the e-learning portal, you'll get an email out with it as well, with the link to follow. That wraps up about this evening. Again, that's the Be Ready to Play program. That's the first in our series of webinars. I hope you look forward to joining us over the coming weeks and months. Be Ready to Play is in partnership with UPMC. And is encompassing the GAA, Camogie Association and LGFA. So if you know people or coaches who haven't registered yet, be sure to encourage them to get onto the e-learning site and register. Again, this webinar will be available up on the Be Ready to Play portal in the e-learning website in the coming days, if there's anything you want to review. So just on behalf of myself, Seamus Burns, Helen McElroy, our speaker tonight, and Des Ryan and everybody associated with the Be Ready to Play program, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks for the next webinar series. Thanks very much.